Today, I'm going to be talking us through the steps of creating an artwork using watercolor paints and some of the really cool techniques that watercolor can do for us. The first thing that you'll need is you'll need your sketch of what you want. Make sure that the lines of your sketch are not too dark and heavy. They will show up in your final artwork unless you want to go and erase them. You will probably need a reference of the image that you're looking at, with knowing the changes that you plan on making it so that you're making your own artwork and not just copying. Watercolor is pretty cool because there's a lot of different things that we can do with it. We can layer it, we can just paint it straight, or we can use some of the cool techniques. Today I'm going to show you wax resist using crayons, salted texture, and layering. So let's get started. The first thing you'll need to do is if you would like to use the wax resist process, is you will need to choose some colors that are usually lighter than the rest of the image is going to be. In this case, I'm going to choose some yellows and whites and a light orange. I'm going to color lightly and heavily in the places where I believe that I should have those colors. So in my case, it's going to be the moon and my stars. I'm going to draw those and then come back and we will see how that affects the painting process. For the lightest areas of the image, it does make sense to go through and erase any pencil lines using an eraser. Do small little erasers and it will erase without bending your paper. If you have any dark marks, they will get trapped under the color and then will show up in your final artwork. It may change the way it looks. Now that I have colored everything I want to be my lightest colors with the wax resist method, I'm going to paint a wash coat over my entire painting. A wash coat means that you're going to paint kind of your base color to get rid of any white that might be on your paper. I don't want any white on my finished painting because if I look at my painting, I don't really have any white except for maybe in the star right here. But since I did my wax resist process, I don't have to worry about that. I am going to paint my whole picture a color. And since my change of my colors are going from being the blue to a red purple and from being yellow to more of a yellow orange, I am going to start by painting a red purple across my whole image. To paint red purple with watercolors, let's take a look at the watercolor tray. Watercolors come in a tray, usually. Then when they first come, they are quite dry. Now I've used mine already today a little bit, so they are a little bit wet. If that happens, that's fine. But the main idea with watercolors is that they are dry until we use them. To make them usable, you will need water. That is how they work. Watercolors need lots and lots of water. So to get them ready to go, you'll want to swipe water into the cup of water by dipping and swiping. Notice that I am not, at this point, trying to mix my brush into there. I'm not trying to use up any of the paint or pick up any of the paint. I'm just trying to get the paint wet. The longer that I let the water sit in the little cup of the paint, the stronger or brighter the color will be. So if I let this sit for 5 seconds, it will be a very light pastel color. If I let it sit for a longer time, it will be a more rich color. However, today I'm going to be doing some color mixing. The top of your tray can be used for color mixing. It's quite nice that way. So, to do some color mixing, start with your lighter color, in this case red, because I will be mixing red and purple. So pick up the color from your tray and swipe it into the top. Pick up the color from your tray and swipe it into the top. Repeat this process until you feel you've had enough. Then, make sure you've gotten all of the paint, as much as you can, out of your brush, and wash your brush. Repeat it for the darker color, but this time don't get quite as much. The darker colors overpower the lighter colors very easily, so start with a little, you can always add more. So, 2 times for me. Then, mix the 2 colors together. Did you get a tone that you like? If not, add more of whichever color if you feel like it needs to be more red or more purple. or whatever colors you're making. Then you can start painting on your paper. I want to do a wash, so that means that I would like a very loose color to start with and a very light color to start with. So if I do a little test right here, you'll notice that color is quite rich. I actually want much more water to start with. So I'm going to start by dipping and washing, getting the paint and adding it on. I can start by getting my paper wet and then painting. The cool thing about the wax resist, you'll notice that my paint goes right on top and the color still pops through, which can be quite lovely. If your brush is too dry, you will notice these little brush marks in your paint. So make sure that you have plenty of paint and plenty of water on your brush as you work. This will help to make sure that you don't have brush marks in your watercolor paint. I'm going to keep going and finish a wash of my whole drawing and then let it dry so that I can do the next stage. I've now waited for my art project to dry, and it's quite dry. It's ready to go. My next step is going to be to start to add the flourishes and the stylistic changes that make the Starry Night such an interesting piece to work with. So on watercolor paper, this technique works a little differently because the water sits better on the surface of the paper, but I'll try to show you quickly kind of what needs to happen here. So I'm going to put my cup really close. So I'm going to paint a very small section, and then while it's still wet, I'm going to sprinkle some salt onto that little section. So that's kind of how this is going to work. I'm going to paint a really small section, grab a little paint, sprinkle the salt. And again, really small section, grab some salt, sprinkle it. Now notice how quickly that paint really absorbs into my paper because I'm not using specific watercolor paper. That's why sometimes we have different techniques that work on different kinds of paper. So this one isn't one that works particularly well on just a standard paper, which is okay. I'm going to probably just stop with the technique now, and I'm going to work on doing what we call layering. So to do layering, you want to have a different tone. So you'll notice that my purple that I used last time was very watery. It didn't have a lot of substance to it. Well, now I'm going to start using a richer tone, one that has more of my red or more of my purple, more of my pigment really in the tone. And I'm going to work on creating the famous swirls because that's really what this painting is so famous for. And so I'm not worried about getting it 100% perfect this first time here. I'm going to work on getting kind of the imagery in place. Sometimes I'm going to use more water, sometimes I'm going to use more pigment, but the main idea is that I'm kind of getting that basic kind of shapes and forms going on in here. Because this is going to be only happening by layering or by having it happen lots and lots and lots. It doesn't have to happen right away. So I'm going to just get a little bit right now with this tone, with this kind of middle, and then I'll make another darker one and I'll layer it again, and I'll make another darker one and I'll layer that one again. And so we're going to get darker and darker and darker, and as we go, we're going to kind of do less and less and less of the painting. Because if I cover everything with the darkest, then I won't be able to see any of the cool kind of effects that I've created earlier. So the idea is that you start big, you do the whole thing with a light color, and then as you get to kind of those smaller and smaller details, you start working kind of less and less. So I'm going to do a few more of these little swirls in the sky and start doing some of the groundwork, some of those marks that make the hills and the town, and then let it dry, and we'll come back and then we'll do some more. I can paint smoothly, or I can paint with short brush strokes. The thing about watercolor is that it makes a beautiful, lush landscape of interesting marks. So even if I start out with lots and lots of paint on my brush, as I keep going, I will end up with less and less, as long as I remember to get plenty of water on my brush as I work. The other cool thing about watercolor paint is that instead of mixing in the mixing tray, you could choose to spend some time mixing directly on your paper. So I've painted some red on my sheet. I'm going to now paint directly with some purple and see how that goes. Sometimes when you paint directly, you can end up with more variations and more variety than if you were to just mix ahead of time, because the paper causes the paints to mix in unique and interesting ways. The main idea is that you use plenty of water so your brush and bristles don't dry out. If you start to see what we call fingers in your paint bristles as you're painting, then you are not using enough water. This goes for any type of painting. In the darker areas of my image, like these hills, I'm going to only paint on the back sides, maybe not across the whole surface. This will help me to see the hills the way they are in the original painting. That is to say, darker in the far away, lighter, and then darker again. Different areas should have different values. That's just the way paintings work. Don't worry if you get paint in areas that you don't intend it, as long as that area is going to be darker. In this case, my central tree, I haven't been worrying about really at all, because I know that I'm going to be painting over top of that area with a very dark color, the black. Oh, you can start to see here where my paint is getting broken up, that my paintbrush is getting very dry. This technique can be used. It is called dry brush. It can create an interesting texture. But if you're not intending for that to happen, or if you're not careful, or if you're rough, then you can actually break the bristles of your brush. If you notice really carefully at the end, my brush is starting to have fingers. If I were to be very unsafe to my brush and go like this, pressing down on the base very hard, it spreads out very far, and that can cause some real damage to the bristles and cause them to pop out and fall out of the brush. Then I don't have a nice brush to paint with anymore. Better to do a nice job and make sure there's plenty of water in your bristles, on your brush, and on your paper to create an interesting work and landscape. The more you layer, the more interesting your painting becomes. The more fun it is for viewers to look and see what they can discover as they look around your image. So one last time, I'm going to let this dry and come back and paint my darkest shapes.